morning, Tatmewi, Inem Winitwas, Titwatit, Soyapa Winitwas, Tai Simpson, Inwas, Nimiipuu Ayet, Inem Nixasa, Hiwis, Tumina Ilkanich, Liloitzat Kina, Katiaya Oikolo, Katiaya Hanyuat. Thank you, all of you, for joining us. Week number 4. I'm excited to see so many of you still logging in and being a part of this knowledge and these presentations. I told you in my Indigenous language that I am Nimiipuu, or of the Nez Perce Nation. I am a descendant of Chief Redheart. My name is the storyteller. I also go by Tai in the language of our colonizers. I am an advocate at the Idaho Coalition Against Sexual and Domestic Violence. And we've been cranking this work out for 4 weeks. We are on session number 10. Today is our panel discussion on sovereignty and jurisdiction. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge that the conference is being broadcast from the ancestral territory of the Burns Paiute Tribe of Oregon, the Confederated Tribes of Warm Springs and Oregon, the Fort McDermott Paiute and Shoshone Tribes of Nevada, the Shoshone Paiute Tribes of Idaho, and the Shoshone Bannock Tribe of Idaho. Idaho is also built on the ancestral territory of the Kootenai people, the Nez Perce Tribe, and the Coeur d'Alene Tribe as well. After 4 weeks, I'm now starting to understand what all of those tribes and how they're spelled in sign language. So I've learned something from our ASL translators in these 4 weeks. So thank you so much for that. If you would like to learn more about the ancestral territory where you are, please feel free to use the Native Map resource that we give to you every week. It is a way for you to connect as advocates and educators with the as non-natives, to connect with the Native community where you are. If you are a guest on Homelands, it's important that you make that recognition and that acknowledgement. It's a step towards reconciliation, and it's a step towards asserting the sovereignty of our peoples on the land that we occupy. Today's event is sponsored by the Idaho Coalition Against Sexual and Domestic Violence. We are co-sponsored by the Idaho Council on Domestic Violence and Victims Assistance. We have some support from the United States Department of Justice as well. Today's particular panel also has contributions from the Department of Health and Human Services, victim, oh goodness, how can I not remember that entire acronym? Family Violence Prevention Services Act. Oh my goodness. Wow. I've been working on this grant for 1.5 years. So we are also supported by that grant, and does not necessarily reflect the opinions or stance of the Department of Health and Human Services. So there is our disclaimer. We are in week 4, y'all. This is an incredible opportunity, an incredible time for us to gather. Just as a reminder, we are in the middle of, or towards the end now, of Domestic Violence Awareness Month. And I did my best to share knowledge with you from the National Indigenous Women's Resource Center. We brought together a panel, several panels this month. We brought to you presentations on different issues regarding violence against and within Native American communities, particularly around missing and murdered Indigenous people. And I hope that you were all able to take something meaningful away. This week is probably going to be the heaviest week. So you've heard over the last 9 sessions, several discussions about sovereignty and jurisdiction, and how complicated it can be. So the panelists that I brought together today are each a scholar, a practitioner of sovereignty and jurisdiction, and then somebody who's been a partner in an agency that also has to really walk the thin line of sovereignty and jurisdictions for many of our nations. So I'm thankful to have them here. Tomorrow is a heavy, heavy discussion, and really the pillar and center and foundation of all of this work that we're doing. We will be hearing from survivors from the Coeur d'Alene Nation and from the Shoshone Bannock Nations as well. And that I hope brings together everything that you've learned in the last month. I hope that in their stories, you hear the problems with lack of collaboration between agencies. You hear the issues of historical trauma, the context historically and even contemporarily that we've tried to paint for you through this conference as to why this problem it perpetuates in Indian country and what we can each do as community members, as family members, as advocates, and as educators to mitigate the violence that we're seeing. So please join us today. Today is going to be very practical application. Tomorrow is absolutely going to be the heavy storytelling piece. So come grounded tomorrow. And then I will also lead us through a grounding exercise in the morning when we get started. So with that being said, y'all, let me introduce you. We have panelist Ernie Weyand, who is a Department of Justice Missing and Murdered Indigenous Peoples Coordinator out of the District of Montana. I've also invited my sister and co-conspirator and colleague, Melanie Fillmore of the Hunkpapa Lakota Nation, a doctoral student at the Boise State University School of Public Administration. Do I have that right? Public administration, perfect. Okay, and then I have sister colleague friend Chantelle Green, the vice chairwoman of the Nez Perce Tribe Executive Committee, an elected leadership position in the governing body for the Nez Perce Tribe. I'm so proud of my two sisters here as far as like what Indigenous excellence looks and feels like. So I hope we get to continue to do this work for decades down the road, and we'll be little old ladies having this conference when we're like 50 or 60 years old. So it'll be great. With that being said, I want to offer each of you a few minutes to introduce yourselves, introduce the work that you've done thus far around MMIP, and then we'll start jumping into some more guided questions for this discussion. Ernie, let's go ahead and start with you.
All right, well, thank you, Ty, and thanks for the opportunity to speak to today's conference, to participate in this panel with Melanie and Chantel. I'm honored to be part of this. And so to tell you a little bit about me, I am a retired FBI agent who spent 22 years in the FBI. 19 of which was working with tribal communities, in Montana, in Idaho, in South Dakota, and nationally. I served for a period of time as the FBI's chief of the Indian Country Unit that oversaw kind of nationally the work the FBI did. I have seen firsthand the devastating violence that occurs in tribal communities. Dealt with it in terms of as a law enforcement officer, responding, dealing directly with victims of these crimes, the very personal effect and toll that these crimes take on individuals, on families, on communities. Since my retirement from the FBI, I am serving now as the MMIP coordinator for the Department of Justice for the District of Idaho. In this position kind of includes some additional work in that I'm kind of overseeing all the coordinators. We currently have 11 that are positioned in different places around the United States, and I, for the lack of a better term, coordinate the coordinators in the work that we're doing and beginning to do. So I'm, again, thank you very much for the opportunity to speak today, and very interested in talking to you about the work that we're doing right now to hopefully make tribal communities safer. Thank you.
Thanks, Ernie. Melanie, how about you go next?
Hi, everyone. I'm Melanie Fillmore. I am citizen of Standing Rock Sioux Tribe of South Dakota on the South Dakota side. I've been resident and settler of Boise for about 15 years now. I hold a master's degree of political science from Boise State University and have very recently transitioned into a PhD program with public policy and administration at Boise State University. I am also the lead researcher on the House Concurrent Resolution 33, the data project to understand data gaps in MMIP in Idaho. And I'm working with the Criminal Justice Department too on that project. I story myself into this work as a survivor of childhood sexual abuse and domestic violence. And I also had a close relative tried as a perpetrator of violence. And so I understand what it's like to be both as a survivor, having lived through that experience. I understand what the struggle of feeling safe in my own home, and spent a lot of time running away from my home and not feeling safe in my own home at different points in time, and holding the story of you know, having a perpetrator in my family going through the criminal justice system and what that can look like, not only for, you know, for that individual, but also within my family. And so as a researcher, I feel really connected to this issue, and I feel like it drives the sorts of questions that I ask in this work, and really grateful to be on this panel with both Chantelle, as we share, we've shared so many good stories together and some healing space together. So I feel very close to her in the work, and I'm really grateful to be here with Ernie, because he actually lived in my hometown for a bit, so that's kind of fun. We actually lived in Pierre for the same time, like for a while. I didn't know that, but we were living in Pierre. So it's really nice to have people to work with that know my home and know where I'm from. And I have learned so much from both of these folks here on this panel, and definitely feel my work has been furthered just by their input. So with that, I'm going to pass it to Chantelle.
Hey, Tots Maybe. My name is Chantelle Green. I'm the vice chairman of the Nez Perce Tribe, and it's wonderful to be here this morning to share the space with both Ernie. This is the first time actually meeting you and hearing of the work that you've done. I would love to pick your brain some more as we kind of move forward, especially with the experiences and being on the ground, boots on the ground experience. And again, with Melanie and Ty, the work that we're putting forward is pretty tremendous, and it's an honor to actually share the spaces of the sisters there. You guys have been doing phenomenal work, and again, I immediately just want to thank you for the efforts that you've put forward, the work that you're doing, and to encourage you to continue learning and sharing and inspiring everybody else that's not quite up to where they're comfortable in their own skin, and or sharing their own stories and giving them a voice that they, you know, hopefully will be encouraged to come forward with their own stories if they are experiencing, you know, the issues that we are covering today and from here on out. So just a little bit about myself. I'm serving a 3-year term as of right now. I rerun in 2021. So I was elected back in 2018. And I served as the secretary, becoming the vice chairman, and I've been leading the efforts for missing murdered Indigenous women and peoples, efforts for the Nez Perce Tribe, as well as the peace officer recognition, and trying to take care of the jurisdictional issues that we face in Indian country. And just to share a little bit of the jurisdictional pieces, jurisdiction in Indian country is complicated for the tribe, states, and federal law enforcement, organizational policies, and court decisions. For years, law enforcement in and around Indian country has struggled with effectively addressing many types of criminal offenses. The jurisdictional issues of investigating and prosecuting criminals in Indian country has been a cause of this struggle. Criminals aware of these jurisdictional issues would often use the confusion to avoid prosecution, ultimately leading into further victimization. And that's a large majority of the work and my personal phenomenology putting forward stems, like Melanie had shared, my own personal experiences with domestic violence and sexual assault. Before high school, I was identified as every statistic that there was. Yet again, sharing, we are not subjected to things that are not of our own doing, and we have the abilities to move forward. And in those spaces, we need to find a place where we can actually heal. And a large majority of the time, we find spaces like that where we can actually share with others like ourselves, and my sisters here who have shared the same type of experiences, and find healing in that myself, and wanting to be a voice and an inspiration for those who haven't found their voice yet. So that's just a little bit about myself. And thank you for having me on this panel.
Great, thank you. Thank you all for your introductions. Much like I navigated through the law enforcement panel last week, I kind of want to touch on a couple of high points, like what do we already know? What's already in place? What are the gaps? And how do we kind of address those gaps? So those are sort of the four pieces I'd like us to organically touch on while we're here today. I think, Ernie, you've been in this industry, I don't call it industry, this agency, this subject matter for a very long time. So can you tell us, let's talk a little bit about what policies and practices are already in place that address the complicated sovereignty and jurisdictions in Indian country?
Well, many tribes right now have response plans in place that, I mean, as we're talking about dealing with missing Indigenous persons, they have response policies in place that, deal with kind of that localized response when there's a report of somebody who's gone missing. In many cases, tribes may not have something, or tribal law enforcement may not have something in place, and might just kind of in the reactive mode. Those are certainly tribes that, as we're doing the work we're doing with the DOJ MMIP initiative, that we're really trying to identify and work with those tribes as they develop their policies. Social services agencies like Child Protective Services, DFS, many of them have policies in place as well in dealing with people that go missing, dealing with the challenging issues that come with moving outside tribal boundaries. That's also a piece on the law enforcement side that becomes kind of a challenging aspect of, what happens when our investigation goes outside the boundaries, our tribal boundaries, and what does that look like? Or what if one of our tribal members or community members goes missing in an urban area in Idaho or Washington or some other place where it becomes more complicated, and we run into many of the issues that you all have been discussing for weeks. There are federal statutes out there right now that really dictate a number of things for law enforcement, certainly as it relates to their actions in missing persons cases. These laws deal specifically with law enforcement response, the fact that there's no waiting period, what response has to look like, or what response should look like in terms of minimum standards. There's also reporting requirements for anybody who's under the age of 21 who goes missing, that they must be entered into the NCIC missing persons file within 2 hours. Also for a child who's under supervised care, whether it's tribal or county or state, if they're under supervised care, there's also reporting requirements if they go missing. With that said, these laws currently don't apply to tribes. So tribes were left off the legislation. As you know that, and you all have experienced much of this legislation that's happened over the years, failed to mention tribes, and ultimately there's not a requirement there. But they are emphasizing best practices. I can tell you in terms of BIA direct service tribes, and 638 tribes should be operating under the existing policies of the Bureau of Indian Affairs due to a number of things, but obviously the focus and recognition MMIP issues have gotten over the last couple of years. BIA, Office of Justice Services, have developed a number of policies relating to response and trying to improve their response in missing persons cases. So they had a relatively new policy or a policy update in August of last year. They're currently going through another revision based on, in part, the work kind of collectively we're doing and input nationally that we're receiving from tribal leaders, from tribal law enforcement, from community members, and from important community-based organizations that are an important part of the problem. In terms of, as you know, there's a lot of work to do. Quite frankly, when I was asked to come in and serve in the position that I'm currently in, I thought with all my years in Indian country that I had many of the answers that, to the problem. I found out in each subsequent meeting with tribal leaders, with victims' families, with community stakeholders, with NGOs or civil society organizations providing victim advocacy, that I've had, boy, do I have a lot to learn. And it's been quite a process here in the last year. So I hope that answers some of your questions. Like I said, we've got a long way to go. That certainly I can talk more about that as we get into our forum a little more.
Yeah, no, thank you so much. That was a great recap of what I think I know from that side. Like, I think we're two sides of the same coin, Ernie, in that I have a certain level of knowledge around like community understanding and cultural relevancy and what that looks like for advocacy. And then you're on this law enforcement side, this agency side that it seems like this foreign black hole of knowledge that I just don't have. And I feel like that was actually one of the goals about bringing this conference together, that having law enforcement involved, having government officials involved, also these survivors and folks who are on the ground and doing this work from a grassroots place, I think helps to inform the way that we address this work in general. So thank you for that. I do want to pause a second and invite folks who are attendees. If you have questions, please put them in the chat. I will try to cultivate those as best as I can, use the Q&A function as well. I know that sometimes these discussions can use language that you may not be able to understand, or there's numbers that we drop that we need to clarify. So please feel free to interrupt us at any point so we can clarify those. A couple of those that just stood out, 638 and then BIA direct services tribes. So what that means is that there are some tribes who essentially use and contract with the Bureau of Indian Affairs to enforce their laws. So they'll have federal marshals on their reservation versus having their own tribal law enforcement department. Actually, Chantelle, we can jump in with you because you have some strong knowledge about these things, and then the peace officer recognition. So if you want to go and explain that distinction a little bit, and then what does it mean to implement peace officer recognition so that we can address violence?
Yes, thank you. Again, thank you for basically explaining what it is from the ground, from the officers' perspectives and experiences. So basically what that is in simple terms, officers working in jurisdiction where tribal communities are located or are often forced to determine their current location of the offense, the political identity of the alleged victims and perpetrators, plus the nature of the alleged crime, all before determining if any action can be taken. This process not only is cumbersome for the officers and burdensome for the citizens, but also may have life-threatening consequences that result into deadly force. So those are the situations that our officers are actually faced with every single day. When they receive a call, they're expressing the major issues because of the jurisdiction or lack thereof. So some of the issues are leading up to basically our officers having determined if they can even make an arrest, and resulting into basically our community falling into this gray area of lack of public safety altogether. And expressions where originally our tribes wanted to go out for cross-deputizing. However, the difficulties with cross-deputizing is that our communities or our law enforcement, our tribal leadership, whatever counties that we are going to be working with or trying to work with, we have to have a better working relationship with the neighboring sheriffs. So the sheriffs of those counties have the abilities to go into cross-deputizing with our law enforcement. However, the issues are stemming from that, or that our relationships and partnerships have been lacking significantly. And when we have a sheriff that doesn't agree with our community, whatever their behavior is, that's what it is. We might not even be able to ever achieve cross-deputizing, and that's an issue for public safety. That basically means that that sheriff is not going to work with our law enforcement, thus leaving our community, basically our population, our most vulnerable. So looking at taking the next step. So basically we're at cross-deputizing and then going into peace officer recognition. So we've been leading that and trying to, I guess, a little bit of history of that back in 2012. I know that there was efforts to achieve peace officer recognition, and they lost by 1 vote. At the time, bringing it all the way up to speed from 2012 to 2018, when we started to pick up and seeing some more of the issues stemming from missing, murdered, ICWA, VAWA, the Savannah's Act, all these different types of acts coming forward to address, violence against women, children, and now with the data coming forward from workers and researchers like Melanie and Ty, is that showing that not only the women and children are suffering, but because there's such a big gray area, the men are also suffering now as well. Historical trauma issues, families that had ICWA before, issues that where children were actually adopted out prior to those skip generations. We actually have one of the folks who was her children was actually taken from her before ICWA was passed, and she still does not to this day have a relationship with her own children. So we have a ton of these examples where a large majority of our families have been interrupted, and these traumas have been created. So our law enforcement have expressed, going after trying to achieve peace officer recognition, which would basically be changing the language and going after state recognition, to have our tribal law enforcement recognized as peace officers, meaning that they would be able to arrest non-tribal folks that are in our jurisdiction. And that's a big, umbrella versus a smaller band-aid like cross-deputizing. So just to share a little bit about the peace officer recognition, by the state. Purpose is to ensure that the tribes are able to provide public safety to all citizens. We would like the state of Idaho to consider adopting language that accepts and recognizes tribal police officers as peace officers by the state of Idaho. This provides a safe environment for all state residences. Recognizing tribal officers will create a pathway for establishing agreements between the tribe, the state police, and numerous counties on and near the 5 reservations within Idaho. Resources are available for state counterparts by establishing mutual agreements for equipment and or officer expertise, which we do with or without those agreements do end up working with the neighboring counties and or local state other non-tribal law enforcements regardless anyhow. So that will ensure the best available resources are available for crisis situations. Crisis and recruitment, we have a lot of issues with that as well. Training and retaining officers. So under the current system, tribal police departments are viewed as substandard branch of law enforcement that often serve as a training ground. Tribal police departments often recruit and send officers to training. However, currently each tribe has to pay to send recruits to post. While it is free for all state law enforcement departments. And when those officers return, a majority of them leave to work for the State Department. Until recently, each tribal officer had 3 years to obtain state recognition. If a tribal police officer was not able to reach such an agreement, he would be forced to complete post again if he or she were to work at state agencies. The costs for this are high for our tribes. The cost is $60,000 to hire and train a new recruit. And then a recent study has suggested that the cost for hiring and training new officers can exceed $60,000 per recruit. So that's what our tribes are facing. It's not just in lack of officers, but also having to achieve higher costs versus the state organizations. The Special Law Enforcement Commission for each officer can submit an application, which is also a long process. But this standard that is currently above and beyond a requirement for state commissioned officers. Recognizing tribal officers has been done in other states. And I believe Melanie might have a large majority of that research as well for the states that have come forward to actually work with their tribal law enforcement and go ahead and approve peace officer recognition for tribal law enforcement. So basically, that's kind of where we're at right now, trying to get some of the language adjusted so that we can actually not just do the mutual agreements, cross-deputizing, but looking at the legislation of the state of Idaho and trying to propose changes to that is basically where we're at now. Trying to advocate as much as we possibly can and getting basically the education pieces and the understanding as to why we're putting this forward. You know, it's not just to perpetrate, you know, non-Native Americans within our community, but it's the public safety. That's highly important right now in our county, which is Nez Perce County. Our sheriff is up for re-election. Both of the situations are looking at the responses are for cross-deputizing, is that it's going to take a while. That's not okay. That's not sufficient answer. That it's going to take a while for the non-Native American community to be okay with our officers being able to rest within our jurisdiction. Well, that to me is not acceptable. And our community has waited long enough. That's the reasoning why these acts are coming forward. is because, you know, we will never be able to heal as long as we're not giving our law enforcement the abilities to protect. Overall, for everybody across the board, it's not us against them, it's literally everybody deserves public safety. And giving the tools to our law enforcement is what we're getting behind right now. So trying to lead that effort and legislation is what, at least for our speaking for our Nez Perce tribe, is where we're at now. So we have viewed some of the legislation that's come forward. So changing the state statute with just a little bit of the verbiage is basically to change and adjust the state legislation on peace officer recognition for our law enforcement. And we've also supported other efforts like Sister Ties come forward with the Idaho Summit on Missing Murdered Indigenous Peoples report that was in December 2019, as well as, and you might have to correct me with the HR, was it
5033
50033, where the Nez Perce tribe and myself have provided a testimony basically expressing the concerns, the identifiers that lead up to missing murdered because of the lack of policy. So trying to address that as a policy woman moving forward. I'm also an Indigenous woman. I'm also basically standing before you know, a state legislation as the most unprotected and a statistic all at the same time, but in the same stature, I'm also a policy level elected official as well. And, you know, expressing that, you know, these changes need to happen and it's going to happen legislatively. So going above where we don't have to ask for permission from, I guess you could say, the Sheriff's Association or sheriffs in these neighboring counties to accept us and to basically take our communities more serious in our public safety efforts, because that's what it is. Just to share just a little bit of what some of our children are facing right now with our MINOC situations. We have, so I think our last number is, even for domestic violence, that cases that we were not able to try, the last number I received from our department was 100 cases. We have 3,500 members altogether. To have 100 cases within our tribe is a large number. Those are 100 situations, and you might as well double that because of you know, the situations also involve not just the victim, but the families of the victims as well, and everybody involved. Some of the situations that we're facing right now for neglect, some of our numbers are reflecting in children, 8 cases. Drug endangerment, we have 32. Domestic violence, 1 currently, and that's probably increased. Abandonment, 4. Declared by law enforcement to be removed, 8. ICWA situations, we have 3, and emotional abuse, 10. And the last number for educational neglect was 0. However, with this pandemic, I'm sure that's probably increased significantly.
Yeah, it's the books now because everybody's at home. Yeah.
Yes. So we are moving forward, recognizing that our communities are still in a gray area, needing to move forward with legislation. We've advocated both at our legislative receptions that we do have with the state of Idaho every year. That's typically in February of every year, as well as the Idaho Tribes and Idaho on Indian Affairs. That's usually held in Boise as well, the capital. And we've also passed a few resolutions of our own. And I guess just to share a little bit of what that language would be like, in case we have other communities that might want to maybe even still or use some of the language out of the resolution that we utilized, which was basically under the shield of public safety. So just, if you can bear with me just a little bit, the language is whereas the Nez Perce Tribe Executive Committee has the duty to, under the Constitution, to promote, protect the health, education, and general welfare of the members of the tribe. Whereas law enforcement officers put their lives on the line every day to maintain public safety, which is also the NEPTIC shared responsibility. That's myself. And whereas historically, there has been a lack of coordination and communication between various law enforcement agencies and resources on the Nez Perce Reservation because of jurisdictional complications and issues with the recognition of and access to law enforcement training. And whereas this lack of coordination and communication has impacted the provisions of law enforcement services on the Nez Perce Reservation, and whereas there is an urgent need to address these jurisdictional issues on the Nez Perce Reservation within county, state, and local law enforcement, and whereas the NEPTIC seeks to enhance public safety by improving awareness and education of tribal jurisdiction issues, and by building partnerships and collaborations with local, regional, and national resources. And whereas bringing awareness and education to these issues through collaboration and partnerships with neighboring jurisdictions will increase public safety for all, as well as remove jurisdictional barriers. Now, therefore, it be resolved that the NEPTIC supports all efforts for public safety, partnerships, and collaborations, including but not limited to cooperative and mutual agreements for tribal law enforcement. So those are the efforts that we've been pushing forward, as well as the Idaho statute to recognize our law enforcement. And I'll jump off there because I just kind of overloaded a lot.
No, that was a very robust presentation, Chantel. So thank you. Like that answers the question. Like we started this knowing a lot of information, right? There's a lot of pieces involved in this. There's a lot of things that are interwoven. I do want to recognize that a question was asked, but I also have a question in that same vein. So I'm going to hold that question for a little bit so we can move into some of Melanie's pieces. But I want to state, and this is because the Idaho Coalition Against Sexual and Domestic Violence asserts that the expansion of law enforcement is not the solution to addressing violence in Native American communities. So I want to state that very clearly. But the partnerships and providing tools to law enforcement would also include advocacy training, some semblance of trauma-informed knowledge, definitely cultural relevancy knowledge, definitely anti-racism and anti-oppression knowledge, because some of these discrepancies, this is more for the attendees that are here, some of the things that Chantel alluded to about miscommunication also stems from the perpetuation of white supremacy, implicit bias. It is somewhat an antagonizing relationship between our non-Native neighbors and the tribal law enforcement itself. Like, so these are very true realities that affect public safety and protection within tribal communities. So while the sheriff's department has jurisdiction in some parts of the reservation, whether or not they address those issues in a meaningful way is also an obstacle, it's also a hurdle. Who shows up? It is not a far reach in Idaho. We just talked about this on NPR this morning, that some of these law enforcement officers for counties and smaller cities in Idaho are also members of militias or white supremacy organizations. So it makes this issue, especially in Idaho, all the more complicated trying to achieve peace officer recognition because of these reasons. So as an anti-oppression educator, like that's something that I just want to name in this space in the same vein as Chantel's presentation. And Chantel, somebody made a comment that they're an attorney down in Kansas for a tribal nation and see and hear exactly some of the same things that you're talking about down there. So that's, we know in Indian country, while we are not a monolith, some of these things are very similar across the board. Settler colonialism looks the same across the board. And what we're seeing are symptoms of those problems that got started hundreds of years ago. Melanie, this is a good opportunity for us to segue into, we've talked about what we know and what's in place. We talked about what policies and actions we're taking as nations here. So what does it look like from a policy place? What does it look like from a data and research place? You know, what things should we know about sovereignty and jurisdiction, sis? And you're muted.
Yeah, so a couple of things. One thing that I really want to talk about as far as from a scholarly, like public administration theoretical perspective, right? When we talk about police interactions, one of the things that I'm fascinated by in terms of my scholarly work, and my political science work is really been focused on the historic use of and institutionalization of authority in the United States and in all of its forms. So in governments, institutions, in bureaucracy, in policy, in all of these different levels, and really how that's impacted Indian country. One of the things that is a theory in public administration is the notion that bureaucrats and those who get devolved authority, so like, right, we have elected officials that make decisions, they get passed down to other institutions, right? Whether that's federal, whether that's state decisions, that authority gets passed down to, right, police officers and other institutions like FBI, like, and that goes for like environmental organizations and, you know, everything that you could possibly think of into public safety. One of the things that is kind of important to understand is that American versions of public administration have viewed bureaucrats as neutral players in this policy making process, which means that that they're just doing a job, and that job is done in neutrality, right? That where you don't have to look at bias, that they're going to you know, adjudicate the law in a meritocratic way, meaning that we can apply the same rules to everyone equally. And that's problematic in policy, right? Because we know what certain policies have done. For example, a really great example of this is, you know, post-World War II, Japanese American internment was a policy, it was an executive policy, it was a 9066 executive order that removed Native people from, or it removed Japanese American people to in prison camps, right? That same, the authors, one of the main authors of that policy became in charge of the BIA and was in charge of termination and relocation. So I just wanted to really get at, you know, thanking Chantel for mentioning policies like EQUA and our, you know, our relatives and family members. You know, my grandmother was impacted by EQUA. My father was removed from her before, and she had no legal way to get my father and his 4 other siblings back. And it wasn't until much later that they were reconnected. But that's the story, right, of how authority gets used in public policy, that the policy and the folks that carry it out are neutral in it, which is there is work being done on that. That's not to say that we see this in public schools too, where you know, teachers removing Black and brown children from classrooms, that alienates them from community. And so we see these ways in which policies really impact choices. And it's not to say that all teachers or white or police officers are bad, right? It's that we have a system that has made it okay for a really long time for these choices to take place. And so as a researcher, it becomes important to question, like, how are these policies getting made? How do we provide training? How do we think through these issues now that impact populations in a disproportionate way, right? And so I think it becomes important to really think through the theoretical implications as well. And that's part of my role as a researcher is, you know, I get to see so many folks, you know, from a bigger level, right? I get to see, you know, our victim advocates and our aunties who are doing this work, who have been just so instrumental in helping me to know their needs and their stories, really. And as well as the stories of our, you know, our tribal governance folks, you know, what are their needs? And also to recognize the needs of our law enforcement agents, like what is it like for them to get directives from their authority, right, from the higher place, and for them to be supposedly taking care of this issue or implementing these issues. And we know from public policy studies that that happens differently all across America, right? And there's reasons for that. And those are the reasons that we have to study. We have to be clear, we have to be open about that, and we have to understand them, and in order to get better data, which is just numbers, but we have to understand that as far as outcomes, and outcomes is like what is actually happening? How is that impacting people? What's the broader picture? What's the story behind that? And so when I think about Chantel's needs, one of the things that I'm really, and Ernie, one of the things that our work on the HCR project, which is really about, it's a very early study. It's a very preliminary sort of overview of, yeah, what do we know? What are the data and definitions used? What are the needs, and then how do we move forward, right? And I think that so, and in that light, public policy is not always made by, oftentimes it's couched in different areas, and no one has the same definitions of things. No one is looking or defining the problem or the issues the same way, which is a real challenge as a researcher, right? And especially as we're working with tribes who hold sovereignty and hold, and, you know, as an Indigenous person, I care a lot about our tribes being able to define these issues in the ways that they need to for their own community. It's not okay for researchers, and even at a state level, to compare and contrast. It is important to aggregate and to look at themes, and I feel really strongly about that. For example, when Chantel was talking about, you know, the peace officer recognition, this is a really important thing, because all tribes are, and Ernie talked about this a little bit too, it's like most tribes do have response plans for, you know, what happens when missing person, you know, when that happens, what is the community response, which is a strategy that has also worked in other issues, like not just public safety, but like environmental or natural disasters or fires or these catastrophic things that happen to our tribal communities. But one of the things that Ernie talked about is that some of those plans they're not proactive, they're reactive, which brings about totally different outcomes. When we're acting from a place of reactivity, it's often from a place of I think of it as your choices seem narrower. And I know that from being you know, living in a situation of domestic violence, you know, my goal was to survive and to find safety in that moment. And oftentimes I made choices that to other people do not make sense, but to me, they were completely rational and like the choice I needed to make at the time. And so I think of this, tribes are put in positions where they're often already doing the work. So many of our tribal communities are already doing this work on the ground, right? And they already have agreements or MOUs with many of our counties, particularly for dispatch. That is not unified across the state, but it's a cost that our tribes are already undertaking that is not necessarily on a more collaborative or recognized side by the state, right? And that's what Chantel's really getting at. MOUs from the tribe are not the same thing as being supported by state legislature recognizing police officers, right? That's a different process. And the power dynamics of that process have historically not been available to tribes, and particularly our Idaho tribes. We know that collaboration has historically been not, it has not been a practice, right? Idaho's really in the early stages of time. And when we think about political science, like modeling decision making, the more interactions you have, the more predictability there is. You have more points to really think about how to make decisions, right? And so we're working on this trust building, right? And really trying to understand the issues means that we have to come to the place where we can have those conversations. And I know, and I'm so grateful that we have so many people on board on these projects to talk about what collaboration really means, right? It is not enough to just have MOUs where the tribe is taking on the costs of, the issue of peace officer recognition, as far as, state legislators, in our state training of police officers and law enforcement, is taken on by the state. It's, they have planned funds and can do that it's budgeted for, right? Those things are accounted for easily. Tribes don't always have or can account for those changes in law enforcement under those circumstances that they're in, particularly with funding, right? And that ebbs and flows from a bigger sort of high level, like what appropriations have the national government been spending on tribes? Do we have a president who's supportive and a legislature, a House and a Senate that's supportive of appropriations for VAWA and EQUA and all of these funding mechanisms that go to tribes, right? And so, for me, Chantelle also talked about, the data on domestic violence, right? The most recent, I was doing the numbers, that's what I do. Like, that's like 30 to 65% of people impacted by domestic violence. And for me, I also don't like just giving numbers. It's useless to just give numbers in Indian country, and I hate giving them, especially when I'm in the academic setting. I just don't think it's helpful. We have to talk about domestic violence numbers in the context that they're in. And that's what I do really appreciate about the way public policy is set up, is that they care a lot. The field itself really cares a lot about the context in which we're pulling numbers from. And so that's something that I've really been critical about, as far as, what does it mean to move forward with a data project? One, we have to understand what's happening with collaboration. And this is something that we don't really have any clear understanding of this via per tribe. So that's something that our project is really working on, is mapping what does jurisdiction look like currently, and where are the gaps. And that also includes what happens when law enforcement is doing an investigation. So I've been currently under training for the process of, how investigators go about making sexual assault and domestic violence investigations. And that matters because we have to be able to ask the right questions, right? And that matters to our domestic violence advocates who are working with our tribal communities, right? Are they getting called? Do our Indian people, and whoever is impacted by violence, do they have an advocate with them, right? Are they protected? Do they have somebody who can be a court advocate, right? So that's, we don't have any information on that. We know that our tribes are doing this work, right? But this is something that we're mapping out, right, to understand it. The other thing is we know very little about the role of prosecution. Chantelle talked about this too, right? When we have domestic violence cases, we know that the quality of investigation matters when it comes to prosecution. And it gets complicated when you have non-native perpetrators. So because Idaho is a PL 280 state, that means that, and tribes cannot prosecute non-native perpetrators. That means that the tribe does the investigation, right? They take on the investigation, they pass it to the tribal prosecutor, they look at it, and then they have to send it to the county prosecutor. We actually have no data on, or at least I haven't been able to find any data on the number of cases that are taken up by the state prosecutors that involve a Native victim. And what that means is we don't know if the cases are being pursued, and we don't know if it's, and also because, of course, the quality of the investigation impacts the way those cases are taken up. So I'm really interested in the collaboration with our tribal prosecutors and our county prosecutors, because that matters in these cases, especially when families or with missing children particularly, or children, childhood sexual abuse where the perpetrator is a non-Indian. These are issues where perpetrators the cases get dropped and perpetration is allowed to continue, right? And in cases that are in tribal communities, from my own perspective, and speaking from my own life experience, it's difficult to talk about perpetration in your family, especially when we have folks in our family who aren't or are protected by our families from being tried through the system. I feel fortunate that this person was put through the criminal justice system as a way for them to seek help because they needed help. And that's a hard story to talk about. I've actually only been, the more I get into this issue, the more I realize how important it is for me to tell that story, because we need to have the conversation about what it means for folks in our family to get the help that they need and healing, and for our families to be able to heal who have been impacted by violence like that. And so, you know, the kinds of questions and investigations matter, and the information that families can give on missing persons or children, missing children particularly, matters a lot, and impacts the quality of the cases oftentimes. And so I feel fortunate as on this project. I feel like in all of good quality data projects, including particularly with missing persons, it requires a connection to our communities, and that we can't leave out also the stories of resilience and the work that our communities are already doing. And so I think that of all the things that I have been so incredibly just moved by the work that our tribal communities are already doing, and you know, hearing stories from folks in communities of, you know, the work of our tribal victim, you know, our tribal domestic violence advocates. Like I hear stories about these folks doing that work. And that's incredible because they're holding the stories of our community. They're holding so much resilience and helping our communities heal. And so it's important that we, you know, as much as folks want data on missing persons and on murdered individuals, or, you know, the crime statistics, we can't ignore the really incredible work that's happening in our tribal communities, that where folks are totally in the want to make plans and want to have a response that's community oriented and is going to work per tribe with their tribal sovereignty, with the resources that they have. this isn't just a tribal problem, right? And that's the one thing that I have learned from Ernie the most, and especially the data part, is I don't have to reinvent the wheel. Like, there's other questions, and other communities that have already done this work that are modeling what data and what response looks like, and what how to work on these issues that are Indigenous led, but also uplifting the work that our community leaders and stakeholders are already doing. And so I think that that's been critical to the work and critical to the data, especially because the goal can't just be the numbers. It needs to be focused on the outcomes, right? The bigger picture, long term, and it needs to be sustainable. And I feel really, really strongly about the sustainability part. Like, the more collaboration we have, the more opportunities that brings for future collaboration. And I'm really big on, and all of the modeling from political science even suggests that even if you take out cultural factors, even if you just improve the number of times that you're communicating and collaborating with somebody, and you get to know them in community, and you spend time learning the issues, that the outcomes improve. And that to me is what I hang on to a lot in this work. So hopefully, I also jumped off the cliff with that, but hopefully we've springboard with some positive, feelings and outcomes from this. And even from my own life experience, like, I feel though, even in my family, healing from violence it's not a linear process. It never happens. It doesn't happen all at once. I can be around individuals who have harmed me, who I've worked on healing in community with, and that's something I've appreciated about tribal communities who are working on with their users of violence, who work on lowering recidivism and lowering the use of violence as a tool for coping. That stuff works. It matters. And though I don't always, I have to hold up my own boundaries and live in a good way, and I want to have good feelings with my family for everything that's happened. I believe that healing is important, and it's possible to heal in our communities, even with the violence, even though we've lived through violence. And so I hope that's what I can bring to, is that I feel we've all been kind of brought into this place, right? And we're all learning from each other in this way to bring about, better outcomes for our communities.
Excellent. Yeah, y'all went in. Thank you for that. I love that. This is the best part. Yeah, Chantel, I welcome any of your comments at this point, or any reflections you have. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I did. While she was talking about like the investigations portions of what we're talking about, especially as well as Ernie talking about the social services aspects, a few things actually came out while we were picking apart both Public Law 280, the history of it, and being unmandated, and then getting into some of our programs and the lack of protections that we have, not just I basically, while we're speaking about the most vulnerable, and then that would be our elders as well. So our later in life program actually identified that we have a lot of elder exploitation, and with that is basically with the investigations, our officers are not able to actually complete those investigations because we're on reservation, and most of our banks or the financial corporations are outside of the reservation. So that basically means that our officers can't go off reservation and finish those investigations, as well as the non-tribal can't come onto the reservation to deal with our tribal members. So that's also another gray area that had been identified, was elder exploitation. I wanted to make that point, as well as while Melanie was talking about what number of cases get taken either by the county or federal. We had also come to the reality that most of our cases or situations don't end up making it, or they don't take them up, which is also not good. And that pretty much is the reasoning why we end up with such high cases and they just go untried. So I just wanted to share that piece.
Thank you. That's the very real implications of having so many complicated relationships. It's the reason why, we have a difficult time addressing this issue. And it should be noted, so while we have these complicated sovereignty and jurisdiction issues, nearly 70% of the American Indian population in the United States lives in an urban center. So what does that look like as far as like extending the sovereignty from the land base to the body that is in the city? Like, how are they taken care of? How are they protected? How do we ensure their safety despite them not being within the jurisdiction of their tribal reservation? There's a couple of other things. I'm a sociologist and a political scientist, so I want to add these to the conversation. Reservations are not like some special place allocated to Indian people. They were prisons. They were prisons put into treaties, and that's how we're trying to navigate that space now. So we should really recognize that there's a misunderstanding about reservation land being some special country. Like the Nez Perce Tribe, for example, had 70 million acres at one point of usual and accustomed territory, and are now down to about 700,000. I learned the Coeur d'Alene Indigenous Tribe has about 335,000 acres from, about 35 million. So like there is just this huge loss of land that impacts the way that we're able to govern ourselves, the way that we're able to maintain safety and protect ourselves, both in a good way that's culturally appropriate and in a way that ensures that the protections of the American legal system also serve us. So that's a huge gap there. What's culturally needed versus what the American legal system is also unable to provide. So that's part of our conversation today. Y'all have really covered so many different facets of the questions that I had initially sent to you. So I want to kind of pivot a little bit because you're bringing in so many different pieces that are interesting to me. Ernie, this question is going to be for you. And I asked this of all predominantly white law enforcement officers or defense attorneys or counsel that works in proximity to Native American tribes. You've been working in proximity to Native American communities for 2 decades. I know another lawyer who's been working nearly 15 years with the Coeur d'Alene tribe. So at what point do you really engage in the cultural learning of our people? At what point do you really intentionally learn about the historical trauma that affects our people? Is that required training for the agents who work within Indigenous nations? Because we feel the gaps that knowledge isn't there. So what does that look like? What should that look like? What do we need to improve that relationship?
You obviously hit on a very important piece of effective public safety, effective policing in tribal communities. And I can tell you from the FBI's perspective, the answer is it needs to happen right away, right? If I'm going into the Rosebud Sioux Tribe or the Crow Creek Sioux Tribe, or I'm working in a tribal community, I need to go in there from a position of respect and understanding immediately. I've told young agents that come to work in tribal communities that if you don't want to be there, if you don't want to invest yourself into the community, engage with the community, respect the community and its cultures, that you will be dismissed and ineffective almost immediately, because tribal communities are, for good reason, extremely sensitive to their interactions with people coming in. it is, you know, from my perspective, and I'd have this conversation with the FBI, I've had it with the Attorney General's office, I've had it with a number of different working groups where we've looked at how to make the FBI more effective in Indian country and in tribal communities. You know, I've talked about our inability really to recognize those folks that will go in with an open mind, that want to learn, embrace the culture, understand these very important concepts of being victim-centered, being trauma-informed, being culturally appropriate, and really understand and know what that means. It is, the FBI does teach that to young agents going in, but, you know, ultimately we need to do better in terms of screening, right? We've talked here about bias and whether you know that bias is there or not. We have to be very sensitive that that's going to exist in some people. And some people are never going to be able to effectively negotiate that in their work in tribal communities. You've seen, and I'm sure Chantelle, with her experience dealing with the FBI, dealing with outside law enforcement, with you, Ty, with all of you who've grown up and lived in tribal communities, just such tremendous turnover that takes place. Whether it's the BIA, Office of Justice Services, folks coming in, primarily Native Americans coming in from different tribes, but tremendous turnover. Indirect service organizations. The FBI has tremendous turnover in Indian country. And again, I think, you know, I am an anomaly, having served 19 years working in tribal communities, wanting to invest my time in tribal communities, seeing the need for effective law enforcement in tribal communities. And I'm not alone. There's lots of, you know, there's lots of FBI folks that have been similar in that they see the need. You know, I've said before, you know, most of us stand up at Quantico, we raise our hand, they ask us why we came in the FBI. Into a person, we all say we want to come in, we want to make a difference. Well, making a difference in tribal communities, it can be hard work, as you know, and it takes substantial investment. And it is, it's something, quite frankly, it's hard. It's hard to get folks that maybe are new to tribal culture, to tribal communities, to working in these challenging communities, certainly where there's high rates of violent crime, places where I've worked in South Dakota, and you know, Melanie, I had talked about, you know, her living in Wakpala, and me working up in those communities, you know, working in Wakpala, working in communities like that, but where there's a tremendous amount of poverty, and there's a tremendous amount of alcohol abuse and challenging family dynamics, and as a result of that, lots of violent crime and lots of victims. And so I'm kind of going on and on, but you know, to answer your question, probably when you start to rank the qualities that are needed out there to be effective, to go into tribal communities, to be effective in your job as a police officer, as an investigator, I would say the number one thing is being able to recognize, to accept, to go in and work effectively with that community, respecting their culture, respecting and having an understanding of the various historical perspectives and circumstances that you've talked about that really guide what's happening there. If I've got that, and I've got the energy and commitment to help victims of crime, I'm going to be successful. I might not be the smartest person. I might not be the most articulate person, I can work around those as long as I have those other qualities. And frankly, like I said, it's a challenge. It's a challenge with every federal agency that's coming into tribal communities to police. And it's something that, quite frankly, we've got a ways to go before we figure it out and before we effectively address it.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that might even be part of the work, because we all have our lane in addressing this, and now we're trying to blur the edges of these lanes. Like we have to look at the intersections of oppression. We have to look at the intersections of historical trauma and settler colonialism. We have to look at the adverse effects of police violence. That's a very real thing. And how do we build and maintain relationships with law enforcement officers so that community safety is upheld? So it's complicated and it's hard. It's very difficult. You're absolutely right. There was a follow-up question about, like, this is the FBI that encourages this learning, but we're seeing that it doesn't transfer to other agencies, right? We wouldn't have half the problems we have if there were a transition, if there were shared knowledge. And a lot of it too is just the very deep-seated insidious racism that exists in Idaho. We see, like, the fact that NPR covered that this morning is low-key embarrassing. Like the fact that that was an actual discussion on national public radio about the racism incessant to Idaho. So we like that is a further obstacle. Yeah, for sure, sis. What's your thought there?
Yeah, so I think one of the things that I have also come, and I hope that this is the future of my own work, but it's to understand too that part of bridging the gap with even Ernie and I's conversations, though they've been very collaborative, it's also been really learning to understand the language that we're using in terms of, like, for me, learning how investigations take place and what does crime mean? How is crime assessed? What does missing mean? And missing means different things in each of our tribal communities. When we get down to the, real, ethno-linguistic differences of, what does it mean to be missing from your community? When we're missing somebody, it's such a holistic term of the way that we view that. And so it's easy for me to see why the investigation process is so frustrating for families, when the way that we define the terms in law enforcement and the investigation process is different than how tribes, communally refer to our own people when they're in crisis. And so I was thinking about, Chantelle, when she talked about elder exploitation, and this is something that's it's not necessarily a new phenomenon, but it is in the sense that most tribal communities really revere, and take care of our elders. And so the idea of, our elders being abused in the ways that they are, particularly with folks that are younger to them, is it's deeply troubling for many of our Indigenous communities because of the place our elders hold, but also, like, in terms of, it's a newer sort of crime in terms of the elements needed in order to investigate that as a crime, right? Mm-hmm. Because a crime can only be called a crime if it matches up with your codes within your tribal law, or your tribal, whatever your documentation for your law and policies are, right? And so that's another gap is do our tribal codes and our laws, and this goes for folks living in the urban areas too, because we know that most native victims are not identified as native. They're never even, we don't know their race oftentimes, right? And so these things that we need to know as part of it, do they match up? Do we understand them to be the same? And that adds to this conversation of, like, who's at risk. And Ernie and I've had this conversation, and I've been reflecting on it a lot, because he's always told me, that he reminds me constantly, like, missing's not a crime. And I think about that because, you know, when I went missing, it wasn't a crime for me to be missing. Nobody knew where I was, right? But it's not necessarily a crime, but you know, identifying those risk factors. And I've been reflecting on this a lot because for me, when I think about our tribal people and, you know, what many of the folks in our community have been through, I feel like, well, everyone's at risk. Everyone's at risk to go missing. And so for me, I've been really thinking about that because that isn't necessarily true either. But as a researcher, it's like, what are the ways that I, as a researcher, can really think about bridging the gaps between like how our communities feel and identify communally, linguistically with kinship, with our relatives, the way that we communicate about our Tioshpe, our extended relatives, right? How does that impact the way our cases get investigated, and what the challenge of meeting family needs when somebody does go missing is also a real issue. But it stems from, you know, digging into like what our community means when somebody does go missing is a challenge with an investigation practice that's heavily geared towards individuality, right? And not a collective sort of practice around, you know, investigating and informing about crime.
Yeah. That's always the other tricky piece too. How do we address prevention as much as we are discussing response today? Like my big vision is always around how are we preventing this? How can I put myself out of a job eventually? Because we're at this point of really discussing only responsive and reactive solutions at this point. But you're right, everybody's at risk. Our communities have been at risk for hundreds of years. And there's some other facets. I mean, to give a big generational arc to this, violence is an issue of a much bigger problem. It is a symptom of a problem. Same as substance abuse, the trafficking, all of these are symptoms of much larger socio-political and settler colonialist issues that our communities have been enduring, and they're all interwoven. And by design and institutionalized and systemized now, which I think makes dismantling some of these obstacles much, much more difficult. We're trying to leverage legislation to essentially ask to be seen, right? To ask to be safe. Like, why that has to be legislation we write is disheartening. The fact that we're legislating for public safety, specifically for Native American communities, because we have data that proves that we are not safe under our current law enforcement system. Like, our dehumanization is legitimized and systemized, and that makes our work exponentially harder. So thank you all for those contributions at this point. Are there any questions to the audience? You have been sitting quietly. We had a few come through. So thank you for those comments. While you all are hanging out, you have all addressed all of my questions, panelists. So thank you for that. I didn't even have to ask them as separate questions. You just jumped in. Perfect. I'm a solution-oriented person, right? Like when we have conferences like this, it always seems to be very problem saturated. It always seems to move from a deficit place. But I encourage you, especially if you are non-Native and attending, that our solutions are strengths-based, they're survivor-based, they are familial and community-based. So there's an opportunity there for you to defer to our community needs, and that is a constant, ongoing, fluid conversation. It is a constant feedback loop, because we're never going to give you a checklist. We're going to test you along the way. We're going to give you things that we need and want, and if they're implemented, then we trust you. If they're not, then we don't trust you and we move on. So those are some kind of high-level solution-oriented things, but that'll actually be my question for y'all to spend a few minutes on as panelists. You know, I encourage you all to dream big in this too. What are some solutions we can start working towards today, 10 years from now, 5 years from now, 3 years from now, any time frame? What solutions do you imagine really improving and mitigating this violence? Any of you.
I'll jump on board on this. You know, as part of the HCR 33 work, it's we are like 1 week away from submitting our proposals to each of the tribes in Idaho, and so we're so close to sending that proposal out for letters of support so that we can submit the application to the Institutional Review Board, which is the ethics and compliance part of the university, part of research. And, you know, we can't proceed without the support of course, and the recognition of data sovereignty of our tribal communities. But I don't let that stop me. I'm really excited to have engaged the proposal, and I you know, I care a lot about our community's feedback towards the proposal and the process and the data, you know, all along the way. And so that's the exciting part, is to you know, to know that that proposal is going out very soon. And so I hope you look in your inboxes as tribal communities to be involved in the HCR project, and to you know, come together again at probably towards June or July, August, in that area for, you know, the findings of that report, you know, pending the permissions that we get from this proposal. So I'm really excited about that, and hope that y'all talk about this proposal in your communities, and with your stakeholders, with your domestic violence service providers, with you know, the leaders and stakeholders in your community, to help us to do a good job of you know, getting some of the information that we're looking for, as far as definitions. You know, what does collaboration look like? How is it taking place? And so I'll be working on that, and really looking forward to the future of the work of, you know, all of the conversations with the folks that have been involved thus far, and continuing that.
Thanks, Melanie. And I'm a constituent in the Nimiipuu Nation, so I can call all of them and tell them to approve your request. I will blow up all of their phones because it's important work. We really need to be leaning into what our expertise is, right? Like I do a lot of policy advocacy. That's my jam. I do a lot of education. I can code switch really well. So being able to present this knowledge and this information to USAO Bart Davis was probably the highlight of, not necessarily a highlight, but it was a new accomplishment. Like, oh, I can make this presentable to somebody who has little to no experience with it. And that was, I hope, very meaningful in our work to end this violence. And I think that that's also an important piece for folks to take away, that we are each doing what we can in our respective fields and in our respective roles, and as much collaboration and innovation across those lanes, I think, is going to be really, really important. Chantelle, what about you from an elected policy position? What solutions are you leaning into? What should we be supporting you and the tribes in?
So I think I had identified, you know, some of the solutions that, I guess, from our standpoint, working in the community, listening to the community, the voices of the community. You know, our tribal members are actually requesting for, you know, us to work on our law enforcement issues with the jurisdiction. So looking at the peace officer recognition and pushing forward on the language for the Idaho state recognition. And then just trying to build upon those partnerships and collaborations, trying to actually bridge those gaps that do exist. And I know, you know, a lot of our community, you know, is, I guess, with the misunderstanding that we don't work with the state of Idaho, and in fact, we very much do. So actually trying to bridge those gaps where they never did exist, So, doing everything that we can to network and to build relationships with, the law enforcement, to the senators, to the congressmen, and just trying to educate along the way. That's where the data supporting researchers such as yourself and Melanie, and putting our best foot forward with that, and getting behind the stories to lead the way. And so basically listening to instill and not just to respond, and move forward, that we can address these issues together. And that's pretty much what I'm looking at as solution, is basically giving the law enforcement the abilities, the tools, to basically say, go get them.
Absolutely.
You have the ability.
Yeah. And even, let me recap that really quick too, because this is a sovereignty and jurisdiction panel. To ensure that tribal law enforcement agencies have the tools and the access that they need to ensure community safety is an assertion of Indigenous sovereignty. That's what it means for a tribe to assert its sovereignty, is for us to have all the tools and access we need, regardless of racial tension, bias, marginalization, that if we as an Indigenous nation can ensure the safety within the boundaries of our usual and accustomed territory, ideally, but within the boundaries of our reservation, that is an assertion of our sovereignty, that safety matters, not just for us as tribal members, but for everybody who lives within those boundaries. And this actually is a parallel to victims advocates providers. The tribal victims advocates providers will never turn down somebody who's non-native. If you need support and victim services, they will serve you whether they're a tribal program or not, because that's building community, and that's our purpose as advocates and as coalitions against sexual and domestic violence, that we will support survivors, we will support victims in crisis, regardless of where that service provider is located. And so that's ultimately the end goal, is that community is community. And that sovereignty isn't something to be feared by non-native folks, but sovereignty is something to be relied upon for safety and community building. So that's some language that I'd really like to kind of underscore as part of our discussion today. Ernie, what do you think? 20 years in, 19 years into this, we're young ones just now coming into policy and legislate. Like, what would you like us to take? How can we move forward for you?
I'm in those years you're talking about getting to one day, being in these elder years. What I would like to do is maybe share with you kind of some of the work we're doing on the MMIP issue, and kind of what that looks like and how that feeds into many of the things that we've talked about. Certainly, we've recognized early on in talking with tribal communities and working with tribal communities and tribal leaders that, we don't so much need just effective response. We need this holistic plan that really identifies those root causes. Chantel brought up a number of things that they're kind of addressing in their community, all of which is a root cause. Melanie talked about these various things as well. We can look at these things. We really, need to get that data piece down and an understanding and analysis of these root causes, and how do we address those? And I think, and I suggest that the answers are in the communities, that they're within the tribal communities, within the power of that community to address these problems. But this is a little bit of an aside to talk to you a little bit about what's been going on since the Attorney General stood up on the Flathead Indian Reservation, Montana, and says that we have this initiative to go out and work with tribes, to empower tribes to address kind of this insidious problem and issues of missing and murdered Indigenous people. We've been kind of 10 months working with Operation Lady Justice, the White House Task Force, and going through listening sessions and consultations with tribal organizations, tribal leadership groups, tribal law enforcement, community members, key stakeholders, and some or many of you on this call may have participated in those. Many were scheduled to be face-to-face. COVID hits and we hit this virtual format that we were all trying to figure out for months and months, but the input was outstanding. I will say, Ty, for you, for your audience, that Operation Lady Justice is still accepting feedback as it relates to MMIP issues and tribal violence in the community, other issues. And if you're interested in contributing kind of written comment to Operation Lady Justice, you can go to their website, and it's Operation Lady Justice at usdoj.gov. And they're accepting comments, I think, for another couple of weeks. They just extended their kind of acceptance period. But I will want to tell you the things that we've learned as a result of these consultation and listening sessions. There's been this kind of resounding kind of agreement, certainly on the law enforcement side and with community members, is really this hesitancy or reluctance in reporting or timely reporting when somebody goes missing. And this problem has its root in many places that you all know much better than I do. But it's historical. There's distrust. There's concern that that once this is reported, there can be a lot of negative effects that take place. But we really have to look at how do we go about and how do we address this delayed reporting or reluctance to report. The other common discussion among tribal leaders and community members is that this is a community problem. It's not so much a law enforcement problem, it's a community problem. And the community wants to be heavily involved in this. When we talked about at a national level, developing protocols for response, tribal communities to a community said, we don't want a national protocol dropped on us, that won't work. We want something that takes into account our community, our resources, our culture, our community stakeholders and community-based organizations. So taking that into account and community involvement, how do we get the community involved in addressing these at all levels? With this, we've had national working groups that have included federal agencies and including a number of tribal agencies, the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children. And ultimately, we've worked to develop essentially guides that communities can work to develop their own response to missing and murdered Indigenous persons problems. And really, kind of the focus is on that missing Indigenous kind of population. And, these guides referred to as tribal community response plans really address several areas that are important to effectively addressing the problem. The first is obviously an effective law enforcement response. Next is kind of that thoughtful and timely integration of culturally appropriate victim support services. The next is kind of media and public outreach, how we're communicating not only to folks through regional media, but how are we messaging and communicating within the community? How are we leveraging those assets specific to the community to be effective in messaging what's happening? How do we gain the trust and support of the communities in their involvement in these investigations through our messaging? How we're effectively integrating our community stakeholders. We've through tribal input, the tribes have told us that in order to be effective, the response needs to be multidisciplinary in makeup. It needs to involve community-based organizations, and it needs law enforcement to work to integrate all these into the response, and obviously needs training and capacity building aspects that will support not only how you implement your plans, but how you can carry these out in the future. So that's kind of where we are right now. We're actually starting some trial plans or tribal developments of tribal community response plans. We have tribal communities in 6 different districts that will be starting here in the next month or two, getting feedback to how to be most effective working with tribal communities. But the important part of all this is ultimately these plans will be developed by the tribe, by tribal law enforcement, by tribal leaders, input from those important community-based organizations. It's not the federal government, it's not outside agencies coming in and telling you what to do. It is giving a framework to look at the problem, use the framework if you find it effective and useful. If you don't, that's fine as well. We're here to help and assist if needed. But that's kind of where we are right now with this issue. Obviously, there's a number of other things that need to go on. The data piece is really needs to be refined. We need to determine how to collect our data, how to analyze it, so we really have a true understanding of what the problem is, not only in individual tribal communities, but outside that. You know, Montana has done a great job actually in their data development through their Montana MMIP state task force. And they have some great kind of analysis that they've done in Montana, showing that, 26% of the number of people who go missing are Indian or Alaskan Native. That is, whereas there's only 6% American Indian, Alaskan Native population in Montana. So disproportionately, American Indians and Alaskan Natives are represented in people who go missing in Montana. The interesting part about their study is that 81% of the people that go missing are under the age of 18 years. And most are runaways who go missing multiple times. So, how do we wrap our hands around that problem? Because obviously in Montana, that is a significant problem. How do we address those factors that are driving that? There's, again, a lot of work that needs to be done. We are finding a number of things through this data analysis, but it needs to take place kind of everywhere where we have tribal communities, where we have these problems. And it, I think has to start at a national level with some framework, but really be refined at kind of the local and state levels. So I've taken enough time, but thank you very much for allowing me to tell you a little bit about kind of what we're doing there.
Yeah, thank you. Myself and Bernie Lessart from the Coeur d'Alene Stop Violence program actually were able to contribute to one of those virtual listening sessions. I got to tell you that trying to convey a year's worth of work in 3 minutes is really hard. Unfortunately, we were able to dig a little bit. Bernie extended me her time, so I had 6 minutes, which ended up just being a prattle of all of the information. And I hope that it was meaningful enough. And I hope and what you just asserted, all of these solutions have to be community focused. They have to be grassroots focused, survivor and survivor family focused. Like what input and what role are they playing to the groundwork of these framework, right? Like that is absolutely the voice that should be amplified as part of this solution process. There was a question from the audience about who has access to the community response plans, but it sounded like that was a community built response plan. So the community would ultimately have access there. So and I actually really love the idea of that organically growing from different stakeholders in the community, right? What do the elder circles say? What do What do the youth leadership programs say? The healthy relationship programs in the tribes. So we've got some opportunities there, I think, to really bring together different facets of each individual community and then building a very robust response there. Ernie from Stop Violence also talked about coordinated response, community coordinated response. Yeah, something along those lines. That's very similar. It's a very similar model. And I think that implementing, you know, our Indigenous old ways of being, our Indigenous community accountability, I think, gives that response a new lens. And I really hope that that moves forward. So that's actually something I'm like now planting seeds, like how can we make that happen? So that's great. Thank you so much for that. And then there was a question that came through, Chantel, that I wanted to see if you could address. You were talking about the number of cases that get handed over to the prosecutor for the county, but that are not taken up. Is there a way to like encourage that data dissemination? Like, how do we make sure that the public knows that that's taking place, right? And even our non-native partners, how do we encourage them to advocate for that for us also? Does that question make sense?
Yeah. Yes, this is an issue, and I can actually get our current numbers, and that can definitely kind of highlight of the real situations that we're dealing with currently. For the most part, the responses that we are getting is that the cases that would typically and should be taken up by the county or go to federal level are overlooked, or I guess say that they're basically kind of put on the back burner and not taken up. As to why those factors are basically the platforms as to, you know, we need these situations to be taken care of. We need our people to be safe, especially when they are being reported. You know, we already have issues with reporting, but when they actually do come to the level of report, you know, basically to get to that level, we need the advocacy to be able to push forward, and these be taken up in the proper manners, so that justice can be rendered to the perpetrators. So that's where the advocacy comes forward, getting our hands on the actual numbers. I can actually work on getting that over to you guys. So I'll have to inquire a little bit about what our numbers are actually at right now currently.
I think it's also worth noting from a constituent standpoint, county prosecutors in Idaho are elected. So if we see these gaps in data collection, we see a huge disparity when tribal cases go untried because they're getting lost in translation or because they are just merely getting left on somebody's desk at the prosecutor's office. That is a facet of accountability for an elected official. County prosecutors are elected officials in Idaho. So that in and of itself, whether you're a tribal member or not, is a part of accountability. So that's also worth noting when it comes to how can our non-native neighbors support us in this work. So I just wanted to name that also. I do want to be mindful of time, and I think that we are at a good place after discussing some solutions to bring us to a close today. Again, deep gratitude for you all joining us in a conversation around jurisdiction and sovereignty. We keep hearing about that being, you know, the bedrock of how we can address this work. So being able to dig a little bit deeper is valuable both to me in my work, to other advocates, other victim service coordinators that are on this call, and I hope other educators. So thank you so much for bringing a robust conversation to us today. For those of you in the audience, just a friendly reminder about tomorrow. Tomorrow is our absolute last session. I hope that you join us. This is the most important session, no offense to my family here, but absolutely the most important session to hear from survivors, amplify their stories, celebrate their resilience, and then really take guidance on how best we can support their needs and then move forward with prevention and response. Those of you who weren't here in the recent meetings or the recent sessions, Boise State University is offering K through 12 professional development credit for your participation in this conference. So we hope you take advantage of that opportunity. I will go ahead and copy and paste that link in the chat for you. Again, keep an eye out for your emails with the evaluation. The evaluation really helps us at the coalition to improve our delivery of this knowledge to you. It helps me in planning and delivery of this education. I work from an entirely decolonized lens for the most part, and that's not always accessible. So your feedback is super, super helpful. This is the first conference of its kind for the coalition to do this virtually, to do it over the span of a month, and in this format. So what worked for you, what didn't, what could we improve? Because I hope that we can continue to spend this time together in community and really celebrate what we're working on, and then collaborate on what our community-focused solutions could look like going forward. We are headed into our last day tomorrow. I'm excited. I am exhausted. Y'all, I didn't know what I was signing up for at the beginning of this, but I am really thankful that we've had a few hundred of you participate, and that really does bring me joy. I hope that you were able to join us in a good way, and that you are all staying healthy, and that that you're taking away something meaningful from our time together. So again, thank you all. I'll see you in the morning at 11 a.m. Mountain Standard Time. Y'all have a nice afternoon. Have a nice evening. That is all. Thank you.